Good morning, listeners. Today we're here with Jeremy Schenof for the second installment of the Avery Dennison and Labels and Labeling webinar on RFID technology. Today, Jeremy will offer a presentation on the RFID market and why it presents an enormous opportunity. This webinar should last about 35 minutes and be followed by a Q&A session at the end. But we do want this to be interactive, so please feel free to ask questions throughout. On your computer screen, you should see a control panel. If you don't see that, click the orange arrow to make it larger. There you will see a drop-down tab for questions. So please, at any point, type your questions in and we'll ask them throughout. Also on your control panel, you should see a white paper from Avery Dennison's RFID experts available for download. That white paper will discuss RFID technology and how it's driving profitability. Once this webinar is concluded, you can listen again at www.labelsandlabeling.com, where you can also find our first webinar on RFID basics. So let me introduce Jeremy. As Senior Director of Global RFID Solutions, Jeremy is responsible for defining RFID growth strategy and solution ecosystems, as well as managing key strategic partnerships to foster RFID adoption worldwide. Prior to this role, Jeremy held strategic leadership positions at Motorola Solutions and Target Corporation. Jeremy has a bachelor's degree in public policy from Brown University and has earned his Master of Business Administration from the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. Jeremy, thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Chelsea. Thanks for having me, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm excited to be here today to share my perspective on the RFID market and why I'm very excited about it. One of the key aspects of my role is to look at this market, look at the growth, and understand where that growth is coming from and where it may come from in the future. And I want to share some of those perspectives with you guys today. So before we get too far into this, though, let's do a quick poll. I want to understand how familiar you are with RFID. So are you not at all familiar with it? Have you not heard of it? Do you know how to spell it? I hope we could at least cross that bar. Do you know what the acronym stands for? Or do you have a tag implanted in your arm? So you're probably very familiar with it.
Okay, let's give them about 10 seconds as the votes are rolling in. Okay, and it looks like majority of people know what the acronym stands for.
Okay, well, I'm glad you guys don't have tags implanted in your arm. So at least we sort of have a baseline. Very good. All right, well, let's start with where we are with RFID today. So, you know, RFID, it's sort of in some ways it's a new technology, but in a lot of ways it's already in the world all around us, and a lot of us interact with it every day. So if you fly Delta Airlines and you check your bags, they're tracking your bags, your luggage with an RFID tag. If you run a race, your race bib likely has an RFID tag in it to track your time and your pacing. Hospitals use RFID to track and manage medications and other high-value supplies. And tires and automotive parts are being tracked both through the assembly process and point of sale. And of course, not shown in this picture are the billions of apparel items that are tagged with RFID today. So RFID is here. It's being used across a wide variety of applications, and that usage is only expected to grow, and frankly, grow significantly. So, of course, this isn't the first time we've heard the story about RFID and its growth. It's actually already gone through a significant amount of hype. And if we think back where we were in 2004 and how some of this hype started, a lot of it began with Walmart when they announced that they would mandate that all their major suppliers put RFID tags on their pallets. Now, this mandate created a vision of a world where all pallets everywhere would be tagged, and billions of pallets would be tagged every year. What ended up happening though, is the consumer goods firms that were supplying Walmart, this ended up being too costly for them, and the mandate was retracted, and the hype ended up fizzling out, and sort of the RFID market more or less fizzled out with that. Now, fast forward about 5 years. Apparel retailers like Marks & Spencer found a new use case for RFID that delivered a strong and compelling ROI. And this was to manage in-store inventory for their clothes. Now, since this, and this use case and ROI has been very well documented, and since this, Target, Macy's, Adidas, and others have started large RFID deployments.
Jeremy, we have a question from the audience here. They're wondering what's changed from 2004 to 2016, and like, were the roadblocks to adoption in 2004, are those still concerns today?
We'll talk a little bit about this going forward, but fundamentally, no. So a few things have changed. One, I think the use case the use cases have become better understood, and it's not about just using a technology for the sake of using it, but it's using it to solve a real business problem that can deliver a meaningful financial impact. So I think that's the first point. The second point is the cost has come down, so the hurdles to use the technology has decreased, both on the tag side and on the infrastructure side. And the third part, I think I'll actually use as a segue into my next slide, which is that the ecosystem has really matured over the past time. So this isn't an industry full of startups that might go out of business tomorrow. This is an industry where you have large public companies who are investing in the technology. And so in each node of the value chain, whether it's chips, inlays, tags, printers, readers, or software, there's companies that are here to stay. So for example, on the chip side, NXP and Impinj, again, large public companies. On the inlay side, you have us, Avery Dennison, you have Checkpoint, which is part of CCL, and then Zebra doing printers and infrastructure, Tyco doing software. These are companies that are in a position to invest and drive growth in the industry. On top of that, there are actually standard bodies and industry bodies to help drive adoption. So there's GS1, Auburn University, and RAIN RFID, which is an alliance of industry players to help promote the standards and drive adoptions. And then lastly, with this maturation of the industry, deployments have become more scalable. So it's easier for customers to achieve their ROI targets and do so more efficiently. And at the same time, for solution providers in this market, they can provide these solutions in a manner that's both cost-effective and profitable for their projects. And so if you look at this and kind of think about this with regard to the last slide and where we thought we were going to be versus where we are, back in 2006, analysts thought by 2020 there would be about 10 billion RFID tags deployed on pallets. Now, that number didn't quite pan out to be what it was. However, the growth did come. It just came from different places, like apparel, and now we're starting to see growth in other segments. So before we go further, I'm going to talk about the growth of the market, but I want to get your perspective on how big do you think the market is? So do you think the market's small, hardly anyone's doing it, maybe thousands of tags are sold per year? Or is it a medium market? It's got some traction, but it's still niche with tags volumes in the millions. Or is it a large market? There are major programs with blue chip end users, billions of tags sold per year. Or it's enormous. Everything has an RFID tag and trillions of tags are sold per year. So where do you guys think the market is from a size perspective?
Okay, again, let's just give them a few seconds to answer. Okay, let's see, share these results. Okay, majority say it's large, major programs with blue chip end users.
All right, the majority of you are right. Well done.
We got a smart audience today.
We do. So let's talk about where the activity has been to date. If you were able to attend the webinar, sort of the first webinar in the series that my colleague George Dice did on RFID basics, you'll recall that there are fundamentally three different types of RFID technology. There's low frequency, which is LF, H frequency, which is high F, and then there is ultra high frequency, which is UHF, also known as RAIN RFID. Now, let's kind of start on the bottom. Low frequency is the one that's probably had the smallest cumulative uptick to date. That's primarily used for livestock and some automotive applications, and across those, there's been about 1 billion tags sold. High frequency has seen a little more uptake. That the two core applications there are tracking of library books and then smart cards and tickets. There's been a lot of volume in smart cards and tickets. If you combine those, probably about, again, cumulatively to date, 20 billion units. However, that volume is somewhat stagnant. I think that market's projected to be fairly penetrated, saturated, and flat from a growth perspective going forward. And so for the remainder of this discussion, I really want to focus on UHF or RAIN RFID because I think that's where if you talk to analysts in the industry, that's where the growth is going to come from, and that's the space that we're really excited about. And obviously, we talked a little bit about apparel. That's been a key driver. You know, cumulatively, there have probably been about 20 billion units of apparel tagged to date. But there's also been activity in other sectors as well. And so one area that's seen a lot of scale is around asset tracking. So this goes back a little bit to that Walmart example with pallets, but it also includes things like, you know, totes and other conveyances, tools, IT assets. So that's probably been the second biggest area of activity to date after apparel. But going forward, I think this picture is going to change, and you're going to see a lot more scale and adoption in other segments. And that's what we're going to talk about going forward. So let's play this forward a little bit and use some forecast data from the analyst firm ID TechX, which is probably the top firm I think that tracks this space. And if you look at this graph, what this shows is the volume of RFID, of UHF RAIN RFID tags sold by year in the millions. So it goes from sort of about a billion, from 0 to about 30 billion on the y-axis. And if you look at this graph, most of that volume to date has been dominated by apparel, because that's where the ROI was sort of first really compellingly demonstrated at scale. There's a lot of apparel units fundamentally to tag, and so that's kind of why we see a lot of the volume in apparel. However, going forward, we really expect to see ramp up in other segments outside of apparel and see that growth kick in. And I think a lot of that is actually going to be driven by the economies of scale that apparel brings. So apparel can push the cost curve down for the industry overall, and then other segments outside of apparel can start taking advantage of that. And so all this coming together, by 2020, we expect there will likely be over 20 billion RAIN RFID tags sold per year. Now, a lot of that will still be apparel, but the non-apparel segments will have doubled between now and then. So significant growth expected outside of apparel. So what's going to drive this growth over the next few years? What's happening? From my perspective, I can think of sort of three forces, which actually align to three acronyms that are going to drive this. So one is around the ROI of the solution. It's documented, it's there, and it's compelling. And so as businesses see that, they know they can use this technology, that it's not a science project, that it can deliver real meaningful business results. The second piece of this puzzle is around IoT, or the Internet of Things. And so RFID and RAIN RFID in particular is a core part of the IoT. And so as more attention and more investment goes into the IoT, it will go into RAIN RFID as well. And the last piece harks back a little bit to the last slide about Impinj. So Impinj's IPO has put a bit of a financial spotlight on this industry and has spurred other investment that will help catalyze the growth in the industry. So I'm going to talk about each of these trends a little bit. And again, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to interject, and Chelsea will cut me off from rambling on here. I want to make sure this is as interactive as possible. So let's start with ROI. Now, I don't want to talk about apparel a whole lot in this presentation, but because apparel is the area that's most mature, there's a lot of documentation in that space. And so there's other examples in healthcare and manufacturing, but this is one that I thought was pretty compelling. It happens to be an example from Macy's and their RFID program. This is based on some research that we co-sponsored with a group called the Platt Retail Institute. And I think what's compelling about this is that, and I'll go into some of the metrics specifically, but if you look across a number of KPIs that were measured, the results that were seen between the stores that had RFID and those that did not were, you know, multiples improvement, so over 100%. So for example, when customers were asked about their ability to find all their items in the stores that had RFID versus those that didn't, those where there was RFID, customers basically responded kind of 2x greater than those that did not, and that impacts something called a Net Promoter Score, which is a key value driver for not only retailers but other firms as well. It's often seen as correlated to share prices. You know, markdowns in some cases decreased by up to 90%, which is obviously a critical way for retailers to better manage their margins. One of the critical other critical metrics is this idea of enabling pick to the last unit for omni-channel fulfillment. So one of the core trends in retail is for physical retailers that have bricks and mortar stores is to be able to use their stores as fulfillment centers. So when an order comes in online, instead of fulfilling it from a distribution center, they either ship it from a store that has extra inventory or that's not selling an item, or they enable that item to be picked up as a shopper orders it online and comes into the store. And so Macy's saw a 325% increase in something what they call pick to the last unit, which basically enables them to show all their SKUs online, which is a big issue for apparel because a lot of the style, color, size combinations, you end up with a lot of SKUs that just have a single unit. So again, pretty compelling results here. There are other examples from other segments, but I think this just goes to show that there is real business value being driven by RAIN RFID, by UHF RFID, and it's not just an IT project anymore. So with this, as this ROI becomes better understood and better documented, you see more and more customers deploying. And so here's just an example of some of the blue chip customers that are launching RAIN RFID solutions. And again, it's not just in apparel. You have Delta and McCarran from the aviation space, Air Canada as well. You know, Coca-Cola from the CPG world, Homley from the pharmaceutical space, Iron Mountain for document tracking. Automotive, you have Mercedes-Benz, Johnson Controls, Volkswagen, Stryker for healthcare. You know, these are really these are blue chip companies deploying large-scale, multi-million tag per year programs across a variety of sectors and applications, including asset tracking, authentication, supply chain, et cetera. And so this to me just shows that there's real buy-in across a broad industry base for the value that this technology can bring. And again, that all goes back to the ROI and the fact that the ROI is documented and proven, because if it weren't, I don't think these companies would be adopting at the scale that they are. So the second driver of growth I want to talk about is around the IoT, or the Internet of Things. Now, in case you were not aware, there's just maybe a small amount of media coverage and analyst coverage on the IoT. I'm being a little bit sarcastic here. There's a lot. If you subscribe to any technology newsletters or even any retail newsletters, you get a ton around IoT and IoT strategies. And so there's a lot of coverage around this, and there's a lot of venture capital pouring into this area as well. In fact, in 2016, over $3 billion of venture capital was put into funding IoT startups. And one way to look at kind of where we are in the IoT is to use the Gartner hype cycle. And if you look at this picture, it really looks like we are at peak IoT, or perhaps even just past peak IoT. And just look at all the dots on this page, which represent different IoT type applications. And the majority of those dots are either coming up the top of the hype pump, they're either at the top of the hype pump, or they're just at the bottom of the hype bubble. And what this means when things are at peak hype is that the expectations for the technology, in this case for IoT technology, is higher than the value that the technology will actually deliver. And there's some, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because when you're at the top of the hype, there's a lot of excitement, but there's also a lot of risk that excitement will not bear out. And I think what's interesting about RFID, again, if you think back to that Walmart story, RFID already went through its hype cycle. So it's part of the IoT, and we'll talk a little bit about how that fits in coming up. But it's already kind of gone through the bubble, popped it, and now kind of reforming it. So it's already on that slope of enlightenment and flow of productivity where it's delivering real value. So the value is proven, but it also gets some of the benefits of being associated with the IoT from a coverage and investment standpoint. So how does RFID fit into the IoT? Now, I know when I sort of first started reading about the Internet of Things, the first thing that always comes to mind is this idea of the Nests and the Fitbits and the Apple Watches and the drop cams and the connected cards. And And these are what I would call, or what others even call, sort of the Internet of Powered Devices. These are things that have their own power source. They have a battery, and they're frankly fairly expensive. You think about how much an Apple Watch costs, or how much a Nest thermostat costs. These are things with a selling price of probably north of $100 US. And when you have those type of items can warrant an active connection on it, whether it's a Bluetooth connection, a Wi-Fi connection, or even an LTE cellular connection. And what that misses out on is the trillions of everyday things that are not connected to the internet and are too sort of inanimate or too inexpensive to warrant a cellular connection or a Wi-Fi connection. So whether that's, again, a pallet or a piece of fresh food, excuse me, or a tire, pharmaceuticals, these are things that it would probably be hard to justify putting some type of powered active connection on. But these are things that can very easily be connected via RAIN RFID. And you could use RAIN RFID to kind of authenticate, to locate, to interact and track these items. So this unlocks a huge potential opportunity where if you think about the sort of the connected devices, that definition of Internet of Things will probably cap out at around 2.5 billion by 2020. But if you look at the everyday things that can be connected via RAIN, that would probably be about 20 billion items by 2020. And the total potential is in the trillions versus the billions. So we're talking, orders of magnitude greater potential. And so this is, to me, is what's really exciting about RFID technology, is that is this opportunity to kind of take the Internet of Things to almost the last mile and connect all these objects that would kind of be unconnected in the past or even in the present, frankly, and allow them to have an identity, to be able to understand where they are, to be able to authenticate them, to see their history using RFID technology. So to me, this is kind of, I think, the crux of what gets me excited and why I think there is a huge potential in RFID.
Now, Jeremy, we have a question, an interesting one from the audience, and they're wondering if this is similar to how the Amazon Go model works.
Right. So I think if I try to explain the question a little bit, so Amazon Go, for those of you who are not familiar, is a retail concept store. It's really a prototype or beta store that Amazon has opened, and I probably should put quotation on open because it's actually not open to the public as far as I know. It's open only to the beta testers at Amazon in Seattle. But basically the idea is that you could walk in, put a bunch of things in your shopping cart, and then walk out without ever having to stop into a cash register, and it bills it to an app. The Amazon Go store, they're not obviously sort of incredibly open in terms of what technology they're using, but from what I've read, they are actually not using RFID technology to do this. They're using 2D cameras and other types of sensors, things like in the Xbox Kinect, to make that happen. And frankly, there are some challenges with that. My understanding is that, at least as of I last heard, that if there's more than 20 people in the store, they can't track what's happening, and there's a sort of a high shoplifting risk. So I guess to try to answer this question perhaps more succinctly is that RFID is not being used, as far as I know, for Amazon Go, but you could use it to deliver a similar experience. So it's very easy to envision a store where everything has RFID tags, and as you walk out, you could maybe scan the items with your phone to pay for them, or you put them on a kiosk and you walk out, and it deactivates all the shoplifting tags and then automatically bills you. So you could definitely enable that type of fast checkout experience with RFID technology.
Thanks.
I hope that answered the question.
I think it absolutely.
Okay.
I think it did.
Great. So let's go into a poll, because I want to talk about go into sort of some segment examples and some case studies. But before that, I want to hear from you guys in terms of what areas are you excited about for RFID growth outside of apparel? So are there no areas? Are you a total skeptic? Do you think growth is going to come from other retail categories like food, electronics, maybe sporting goods, DIY, et cetera? Or maybe the medical slash healthcare, maybe even slash pharma space as well, asset tracking and supply chain, aviation, or from somewhere else? What do you guys think?
Okay, let's give them a second. Ooh, these are really close here. 5 more seconds. Okay. Most say asset tracking and supply chain.
All right, well, we'll cover one of those case studies, so that's good. I'm glad I picked one of the ones you guys are interested in. So before we go into the detailed case studies here, I want to talk through just some high-level segment examples, and some of these we'll double-click on as we go in. So we talked a little bit about apparel. I mean, I'd be sort of remiss not to put it on here just because it's such a huge volume. So I want to talk about for these segments some of the key use cases, and for those use cases, what's driving ROI. Because again, RFID is a technology, but adoption comes down to ROI, which is the value that the end customers get out of the technology. So it's a critical point. So you hear me talk about it a lot. So starting with apparel, a lot of the opportunity historically has been around in-store inventory accuracy, so within the 4 walls of the store. Now we're seeing it being used for more omni-channel fulfillment, such as ship from store, buy online, pick up from store, and the ROI comes from using the technology and the inventory visibility from the technology to get better sales lift. And fundamentally, that's because if you don't have an item on the floor, you can't sell it. If I walk into a store to buy a shirt and they don't have my size, assuming I don't ask for it, I'm not going to buy the shirt. So that's critical. And then fewer markdowns is the other area which we talked about before. And so this is already happening today. Now, one of the areas where we're excited about over the next few years is around fresh foods and using RFID to manage food expiry dates. So if you think about, your sort of meat case or your poultry case in your local supermarket, all those items have a date by which the item needs to be sold, and it's a pretty manual process to go around and check the dates of each of those items and see which ones are going out of life today, tomorrow, pulling the ones out. And so this actually leads to a lot of kind of staff resources being spent in it, as well as waste, because things aren't getting thrown away or marked down at the right time. And so we feel that using RFID creates a huge opportunity to reduce the amount of waste within retail, as well as improve the labor productivity of the staff, so they're not spending all this time checking dates and can do other higher value activities. So the third use case and segment I want to talk about, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next couple slides, is baggage tracking. So you see this today. Delta made a lot of headlines. Some other airports like McCarran, Las Vegas is doing it, and we think there are compelling reasons for other airlines to follow suit, including a resolution by the airline industry body IATA that all airlines and airports have to have more baggage tracking points going forward. So this is really around giving customers more certainty of where their baggage is, and I think one of the things that could translate into in the U.S., where you have to pay fees for baggage, is more of that fee revenue. But it also means airlines have to spend less money compensating customers for lost bags, and they also kind of improve some of the productivity of their ground force as well. The last segment I want to talk to here is healthcare. There's a lot of use cases in the healthcare space, and a lot of them fall into this medication and supply tracking. So using it to either track pharmaceuticals or high value items like stents and catheters. And so the ROI that comes out of this is around staff productivity. So if you think about a nurse at a hospital, instead of that nurse spending their time looking through inventory and seeing what's going to expire, they could actually spend time with patients, which is probably what they want to be doing and what the hospital wants them to be doing. At the same time, RFID supply tracking enables hospitals to better track what supplies are being used for what patients, and this enables them to charge those supplies back to that patient's visit and recover the insurance money for that. Because if they can't adequately or appropriately do that, they can't recover that cost. So that's obviously a big driver as well. And then lastly, a lot of these products have shelf life, and so RFID can help cut back on the number of expired products that hospitals are using, both from a pharmaceutical perspective and a supply perspective. Okay, so now I want to talk about a few, a little more detail on a few specific case studies. So you guys said that asset tracking was an area of interest. This first case study from Johnson Controls falls into that category, I think, and this is around tracking their returnable containers. So these are kind of the containers that move back and forth through their supply chain, from their manufacturing to their DC to their customers and back. The containers that hold the items that they're shipping, and these containers they're very slow moving. There's a lot of loss throughout the supply chain, and it is a manual and inefficient process to track them. So they have to call up different facilities. Things are tracked on paper, and it's kind of a time-consuming process. So the solution they proposed was to tag almost a million, about 900,000 different products, install RFID readers in their DCs and their doors to see how things are coming and going, and then doing weekly cycle counts. And the impact this has had, it's allowed them to identify shipping delays, understand which customers are not returning containers so they can chase them down, and as a result, order fewer replacement containers, which is a decrease in capital expenditure for them. And all this led to a less than 1 year payback. For those that, financial folks on the call, that's a pretty compelling ROI if you can get a payback on your investment in 1 year. So that's the Johnson Controls example. It falls into that asset tracking supply chain space. The second example is from the medical space, and this is from a company called KitCheck, and they work on these things called pharmacy kits that are used in emergency rooms. So it's a kit of common pharmaceuticals that emergency rooms use often to treat patients as they come in. And the restocking of these kits is, again, it's a very manual, time-consuming process. It's error-prone, and it prevents hospital staff from focusing on higher-value patient-facing activities. So the solution that KitCheck designed is that each medication is tagged, has an RFID tag on it. And so when the kit comes back, they put it in this smart cabinet that reads the tags, it identifies what medications are missing or expired, and it gives the pharmacist a restocking checklist. And so the impact that this has had, it's enabled the hospital pharmacist to reduce the time spent restocking by 96%, so pretty compelling reduction. It's eliminated human error. In one example, it results in a $1,000 per kit savings and a 75% ROI in year one. So pretty compelling financial metrics and KPIs coming out of KitCheck. And these guys actually have a great website with a lot of examples in terms of the benefits that they've seen with some great case studies if you're interested in learning more about that one. And the last one I'll talk about here is Delta Airlines and baggage tracking. They've obviously made a lot of headlines with this initiative, and it's a really great example of how you could use RFID to transform a process. So the problem here is that mishandled bags cost the airline industry, so the overall industry, about $2.5 billion a year. It's actually the #2 customer service complaint after flight delays. So people complain about lost or missing luggage after, that's the second most common complaint after the flight problem. And Delta actually have been performing pretty well around baggage handling, but using barcodes, but they hit a ceiling around the amount of improvement they could drive. And so they were striving to do more, and they felt RFID was the best option for this. So they deployed a fairly large-scale program, 4,600 scanners, 3,800 readers, that covers about 85% of their baggage volume. So a lot of airports coverage, and they took this baggage tracking data and they actually integrated into their Fly Delta app. And so the benefits that they were able to drive from this was not only improved baggage handling performance, so reducing the amount of lost or mishandled bag, they also enabled safer working conditions for their aircraft and ramp crew. And I think perhaps most interestingly is they've delivered a very compelling customer experience by pushing this data to their app. So you can pull up a map and see where your baggage is on the map with a pin dot. You can have push notifications when the bag hits different tracking points, and you know when it's going to come out of the conveyor belt. So you know whether you're in a rush to get down there or not, or whether you have time to grab a cup of coffee after your 7 a.m. flight, as I often like to do. So this is a pretty compelling example, and one that I'm pretty excited about. So to summarize here, and then we'll open it up for questions, is the UHF and the /RAIN RFID space has experienced tremendous growth, and this growth we only expect to continue growing forward, and that's because the solutions are hardened, they're proven. There's a value chain and scale to deliver it, and deliver it at a compelling ROI for end customers. RFID enables really the last mile of the IoT. It allows us to connect the everyday things that previously would not warrant a connection. And this allows a diverse set of applications that can create value across multiple segments, both today and even more so in the future. So with that, I thank everyone for your attention, and I'll open it up for any more questions.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. That was so great. It was very informative, and we have lots of questions. So I'm just going to jump right into them, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the next couple minutes. This one here says that they saw an interview with an Avery Dennison executive recently who spoke about the development of a microwave-safe tag. They're wondering how this could potentially open up the grocery market. Can you talk a little bit about how realistic grocery is as a market for RFID?
Yeah, so I was kind of going back to one of my slides. We're pretty bullish on the grocery market. We think it fits a lot of the profile that makes sense to drive RFID adoption in terms of at least certain parts of it, particularly kind of the fresh foods. It's kind of at the right price point. There's a business challenge there, and we think that business challenge can be addressed via UHF, via RAIN RFID. So that's a segment that we're pretty excited about, and so I'm not surprised that you've heard our team talk about it enthusiastically and recently, and I'm sure you'll hear us continue to talk enthusiastically about sort of our excitement around the fresh food space for RFID.
This listener wants to know, they say that tags come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and as we learn frequencies, how do we know which tag is fit for our purpose, or which tag is right for which application?
Talk to us. I mean, I think, in all seriousness, it's not, if you work with one of the core tag suppliers, we could easily help you figure out what the right tag for the right application is. I mean, it's not, there are different tags for different reading scenarios and different use cases and different environments. So I don't recommend you buying every tag and try to stick them on and test it yourself. There are folks in the industry who can help do this. But again, it depends on, do you need to tag something that is in a heavily liquid environment, or something that might be in a metallic environment? That requires a certain set of tag characteristics. Are you reading with a handheld reader or a tunnel reader or an overhead reader? That requires a different set of tag characteristics. Is your item small and you need a small tag, or large, you need a large tag? So there's a number of variables that are at play, but folks like us can help you work through those challenges.
And what are the most used substrates or materials for these labels and tags?
That's a good question. It's probably a little bit outside of my area of scope. I know, my colleague George Deich did a kind of an RFID basics, and I think he might have covered that in his. So I might have to defer that one for later. But I mean, a lot of them are on, PET is pretty common. Paper is pretty common. I think those are probably two that I would reference.
Yeah, and that also answers another question. People were asking if they could listen to the webinar after, and it is going to be available on labelsandlabeling.com under our video section of the website. So they can listen to George's presentation as well as this one to learn a little bit more about that. This one is saying, you talked mostly about how large companies are using RFID. What are your expectations for the everyday consumer to interact with RFID? Yeah,
that's a great question. And so there's sort of two ways to look at this. So there's sort of the consumer interacting with and again, I'm going to talk about sort of UHF or RAIN RFID here, interacting with a UHF or RAIN RFID tag via their smartphone, which is kind of how we think about interacting with things today. That is not enabled today. There is not a RAIN RFID reader in sort of commonly available in consumer devices. We think it'll get there, and there's some movement in the industry towards this, but that will probably come, you know, several years down the line. I'm not going to try to predict when it will happen, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. That said, there are ways that consumers can sort of interact with RFID tags through other types of scenarios. So one example is sort of a smart fitting room type application within the apparel space. So Ralph Lauren, in one of their flagship stores, they have a smart fitting room where you walk into the fitting room with your clothes. The clothes have RFID readers. It knows what you brought in, and you can kind of select different merchandise. You can, you know, ask for different size, and so that's a way to interact with RFID products through some sort of third-party infrastructure. So that's probably what's going to happen more in the near term, and then longer term, once RFID antennas make it into cell phones, consumers will be able to interact potentially directly with RFID tags.
Okay, and there's a couple questions here about security. Is there still kind of resistance from groups who are scared of personal privacy, and I guess how secure are the RFID tags?
Yeah, so I think security is not really it's not really an issue, because at the end of the day, it's kind of just a license plate that's on the tag. So if you have an RFID reader and you walk by a Macy's store, you know, you might be able to read their tags, but it's not going to really tell you anything because you're just getting a bunch of numbers. So you know, we don't see security as a major concern. I don't think any customers that we talk to have identified it as a roadblock. I know there's a lot of, you know, I subscribe to sort of RFID news feeds, and it feels like every day there's some story about an RFID blocking a wallet. I think that's frankly more around NFC than it is around UHF, because, you know, NFC is more what's in sort of, you know, credit cards and things of that nature. But, you know, in the products that we work on, we don't see it as a major hurdle.
This one here says, what is our role in this when a customer is interested in RFID? Is there technical training for sales?
I guess I'm a little trying to just understand the question a little better. What is our role?
I think I'm guessing that might be a label converter, and they're interested in, you know, how they can learn more about technical training if they decide to deploy these.
Yeah, so I think one good resource. So last year, one of the things I encourage those interested to do is attend the trade show RFID Journal. And so, you know, it's probably the primary industry trade show. It's once a year in the spring, in the May timeframe. I believe it's in Orlando this coming year, in 2018. And they have a number of workshops that you could participate in to get training around it. In fact, last year we hosted a day-long seminar focused on label converters, where I gave a presentation similar to this. We talked about building a business case around RFID. We talked about the basics of the technology. We talked about how to choose a tag, how it's manufactured. So that's probably the best, you know, if you wanted to just sort of spend a day and get immersed in it. I think that's probably the best example of that type of thing that comes to my mind.
Okay. Another question, I'll probably just take maybe one or two more, but a couple questions on cost. Are there any breakthroughs on the horizon in terms of the cost of tags in order to stimulate more demand?
Breakthrough. So I think the cost comes down every year as the volume increases. So, you know, in terms of breakthroughs, you know, I think there's nothing I could speak to directly, but as the technology scales, the cost per tag comes down each year to the point where, you know, more and more applications get opened up. And again, a lot of, you know, the cost is obviously an important factor, but it's really around understanding the sort of the value and the business case, and the cost of the tag is one input into that. And so, you know, a lot of times we say that if the if the business case doesn't work at 6 cents, it might not work at 5 cents as well. And so I think coming back to my point around the ROI is that if you have a good understanding of the business case, you can do some sensitivities around tag costs and say, okay, or not only tag costs, but reader costs, services costs, et cetera, right? It's all kind of part of the equation. You can do sensitivities around that and say, okay, well, what do these components actually need to cost to deliver the value? And I don't think we're going to see like a major step change to say, okay, a tag's going to cost 1 cent tomorrow. That's unlikely. But each year we do see sort of incremental improvement in the cost structure.
Okay, very good. So we're coming up on the hour here, Jeremy, and we still have loads of questions. I'm wondering if you wanted to give your information and how they might be able, or tell our listeners how they might be able to find more information or get those questions answered.
Yeah, so I would definitely say contact Avery Dennison, or I think you guys can see the thank you page. So averydennison.com/RFID is how to find us, as well as via LinkedIn, on Twitter. If you want to reach out to me, my email is my first name dot my last name at averydennison.com. So that's probably what I would suggest going forward, if there's any further questions or interest.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. And that will, conclude our webinar, but we kindly ask you to take a couple seconds to complete a quick survey that will be sent out to you that will just help us at Labels and Labeling and Avery Dennison continue to bring you top-notch content like Jeremy presented today. And again, you'll be able to listen to this webinar later today at labelsandlabeling.com, where you also can find the first Avery Dennison Labels and Labeling webinar on RFID technology. And thank you so much. And also stay tuned. We have one more webinar planned in this series that will be launched later this year. So stay tuned for more information on that. Jeremy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.